What was your father's, Milton Friedman's, thoughts on you being an anarchist?
He thought that the institutions I described probably wouldn't work but might. And I thought they probably would work but might not. And that's not the kind of thing, given that we don't have any way of knowing for certain how untried institutions will work, that's not the sort of thing that one can reasonably expect to prove to each other. The fundamental difference wasn't that. The fundamental difference was that the project he was interested in was improving our society as it now exists. So he was willing to propose things that were sort of at the edge of what might happen, some of which, such as abolishing the draft, did happen, some of which, such as legalizing drugs, haven't yet, but we're gradually moving in that direction. And while I certainly agree that that's a valuable project and have spent some energy on it, the project that really intrigued me was trying to figure out how far you could carry these principles, whether there was any limit or whether you could, in effect, privatize everything. And that's just struck me as an interesting intellectual project. And I learned a good deal in the process of working on it.
I'll ask one more question, then I'll pass it off to someone else.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on like the Rothbardian justification for anarcho-capitalism based on like the natural property rights?
Yeah. I share some of those moral intuitions. It feels wrong to me to steal from people and such. On the other hand, actually getting from there to institutions is not all that easy if you really think about it. For example, am I entitled to steal from you if that's the only way of preventing Paul from stealing from Benjamin? If you think about the question of whether it's legitimate to have a tax-funded police force, which is essentially that problem. Am I entitled to steal from lots of people if I don't collect taxes from them, the Soviet Union will conquer us and make us much less free? So there are a bunch of questions which I don't think are really answered by saying it is always wrong to initiate coercion. Beyond that, as far as I can tell, neither Rothbard nor anybody else has ever really come up with a convincing demonstration of what moral beliefs are true. I happen to have moral beliefs not too far from Rothbard's, probably not identical, but I don't think I can prove them. So if somebody just says, I don't see what's wrong with this, it's perfectly legitimate to initiate coercion for a sufficiently good cause, all I could say is, well, that's your view. It may not be my view. So the strategy, in a sense, there's a sense in which it's a tactical or even a strategic problem. That my view is that I can't prove to people what's good. However, the variation in what people think is good is not all that large. That there are very few people who think it's a good thing for other people to starve to death, or a good thing for people to be ignorant and sick and so forth. I believe that the institutions I'm arguing for are not only somewhat better than the alternative, but a lot better. And if they're a lot better, then they are likely to be better in terms of the objectives that most people have, even though those objectives aren't all the same. So if you say, I really care about the poor, I would say, well, that's fine. I think the poor are important. You may have noticed that as the world has become more capitalist over about the last 30 years, the number of people in extreme poverty has dropped by a factor of 3. You may notice that if you compare capitalist and socialist societies that were closely related and adjacent, North Korea, South Korea, East Germany, West Germany, China, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, that the poor people ended up a whole lot better in the capitalist ones. So in that sense, I don't have to argue about whether the right objective is helping the poor or helping everybody or helping the rich or technological progress or other things people might value, because my best guess is that something close to my system will work for all of them. And my main reservation on that, which I've discussed at some length, especially in the 3rd edition of my book, is there are circumstances in which my system would break down. And therefore, I cannot claim that for all societies and all possible situations what I just said is true. But I can claim that I have good reason to think that if the system is workable, we can expect it to work better than any alternative, and that it is likely to be workable for many societies much of the time, as it were. I think that's the most that I'm willing to claim. Other questions?
Bean, your question?
Yeah. I was wondering what you thought about the critique from Robert Nozick about anarcho-capitalism eventually becoming a minimalist state or a minarchist state.
Yeah, I don't think it's true. I'm afraid I read that book a very long time ago. I can report that a very long time ago, I gave a talk on the book in which I offered my reasons for thinking he was mistaken at a Libertarian Party event at which Nozick was present. And Nozick was in the audience. And his response to the arguments I offered then was not to try to defend his position, but to offer what I think is a stronger argument for his position, namely that if anarcho-capitalism is a workable system, why don't we see it in modern societies? Probably he said, why don't we see it? And at the time, I would probably not have had good examples to say, well, we do see it just in very different societies. But in any case, and that's a legitimate argument, I don't think it's a conclusive argument, because after all, the set of institutions that are now the norm for developed countries were non-existent 200 years ago. I cannot think of any society, say in 1800, which had all races and both genders voting, women having essentially the same legal rights as men, government controlled by mass voter democracy, and government spending something between a quarter and half of the national income. I don't think any society with those characteristics had ever existed in 1800. And yet at this point, essentially all developed societies pretty much, there are probably a few exceptions, have those characteristics. So things do change. And part of what changes are things like technology, but part of it is also ideas. And I'm sort of in the idea business, that I like to say that democratic systems are like a old-fashioned microscope which has two controls, a coarse control and a fine control, if any of you have ever used one of those machines. The fine control for democratic systems is special interest politics, basically lobbying groups who can say to a legislator, if you pass this law to favor our group, here's what we'll do for you. The coarse control is mass voting based on free information. That is to say, the individual voter has no incentive to make sure that the information he votes on is correct, because the individual voter, except in a very small society, knows his vote is almost certainly not going to affect anything. So it makes sense for the individual voter to say, which politician makes me feel good, or which party should I adhere to if I want my friends to like me because they all adhere to that party, things like that. So it's not that's why it's a coarse control mechanism. But it's a coarse control mechanism that's driven largely by free information. So if almost everybody believes that something is good, it then becomes politically profitable for a politician to at least say he's doing that something and maybe even to do it. And that means that one of the ways of trying to change things in such a system is to change the mix of free information, to arrange things somehow by putting ideas out, by expressing ideas in some persuasive form, so that more people believe things more nearly what you want them to believe. So I would have said that both my father and I and Rand were very successful in that project in very different ways. That Rand wrote novels that a very large number of people read. The novels were very persuasive. I don't think they were entirely right, although they were in part right. And my father wrote books and did a television series, which resulted in a whole bunch of people being exposed to his ideas, and some of them at least absorbed the ideas and agreed with them. And of course, lots of people on the other side. George Bernard Shaw was doing the same thing on the other side, and so are a fair variety of other people. Krugman tries to now. So anyway, so I guess that would be one way in which you try to change things. But no, as far as the problem is that it's been too long since that argument. And my impression is that there is no obvious reason why you would end up with a single firm. You could, but most industries do not have an equilibrium at a monopoly. That's a fairly unusual, though possible situation. Because as a general rule, as the size of a firm increases, you can, for a while, you can take advantage of physical economies of scale. It's easier to make cars if once you've got the relevant machines, you're making lots of cars with the machines. But then you run into organizational diseconomies of scale, because the larger the firm is, the more levels there are between the president and the factory floor. Therefore, the more resources you've got to devote to passing information up and down and controlling the people at the bottom, and the less good job you do of it. So the result is that in most industries, you end up with an equilibrium with multiple firms. There are some industries, say restaurants, where you end up with a huge number of firms, and some where the economies of scale are large, like computer software, you end up with a much smaller number. It's not logically impossible that rights enforcement could be one of the natural monopolies, especially in a very small society, but I don't see any reason to expect it would be in a society the size of ours.
Did you enjoy these clips? Want to hear the rest of the episode? Click the links below to listen to the full episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other popular streaming apps. Remember to support us, and you can do this by checking out our Instagram pages at YIP Institute and at Watch Verbum. You can also look at our website at www.yipinstitute.com. Make sure to follow our page as we upload weekly. Have a good day.